What strange events got quietly erased from history like they never happened? Story 1. Shelley Miscavige is the wife of David Miscavige, the leader of the Church of Scientology. She was last publicly seen in August 2007. Since then, across more than 17 years, she has made no confirmed public appearances, given no interviews, attended no events, and has not been photographed in any context that can be independently verified. When actress Leah Remini, herself a former Scientologist, filed a missing persons report with the Lapt in 2013, the Lapt subsequently announced they had located Shelley Miscavige and confirmed her safety, without specifying where she was located, under what conditions she was found, or whether the contact constituted a genuine welfare check or merely confirmation that she was alive. The Church of Scientology has consistently maintained that Shelley Miscavige is a private person who chooses not to make public appearances. No independent journalist, family member outside the church, or government welfare official has conducted a publicly documented face-to-face welfare check with full independent confirmation. The Lapt statement that she was located and is fine, without further detail, is essentially the entire content of the official response. Shelley Miscavige previously held a senior position within the church's administrative structure. Former Scientology officials, in interviews and memoirs published after leaving the organization, have described her as being effectively disappeared within church facilities following an argument with her husband over organizational matters. These accounts are from people the church categorizes as hostile former members, which is the church's consistent position on all critical testimony. What can be stated without controversy? A woman who was once publicly visible in a specific role has not been publicly visible for 17 years. A missing persons report produced an undetailed official response, and the question of her actual current conditions and welfare has not been publicly resolved by any independent source. Story 2. The Phoenix Lights. A governor saw it too and waited 10 years to admit it. On March 13, 1997, thousands of people across Arizona. The numbers genuinely run into the thousands from independent accounts, reported watching a massive V-shaped formation of lights move silently across the sky, from north to south at low altitude, covering the distance from northern Arizona to the Tucson area over roughly 2 to 3 hours. The object, or formation, was described as enormous by witnesses who attempted to gauge its size relative to the night sky. Home video footage from multiple independent locations shows the same formation at roughly the same time. The person writing this entry was among those witnesses, standing on their street, watching it pass overhead with their family and neighbors, in a state that they describe as speechless terror. This is the texture of first-hand accounts that gives the Phoenix Lights case its specific character, not the accounts of single isolated individuals, but of people who were with other people, on streets, in groups, sharing a simultaneous experience that nobody could explain. Governor Fife Symington held a press conference days after the event and brought out an aide dressed in an alien costume, mocking the witnesses and framing the incident as mass hysteria. 10 years later, in a 2007 CNN interview, Symington acknowledged that he had personally seen the formation during an evening run that night, that it was enormous and unlike anything he had ever seen, and that he now believed it was genuinely unexplained. He had publicly mocked an experience he had privately had. The Air Force explanation, flares dropped by military aircraft during a training exercise, is disputed by witnesses who observed the silent, massive, coherent formation at low altitude and described it as nothing like flares. The flare explanation accounts for a separate, later set of lights over the Phoenix area. The earlier formation, with thousands of witnesses, remains officially unexplained. Story 3. The Facebook AI secret language story is less dramatic than you've heard. But the real story is interesting. The story that circulates about Facebook's AI lab, that they created robots named Alice and Bob, that Alice and Bob spontaneously developed a secret language neither their creators nor anyone else could understand, and that the program had to be emergency shut down, is a garbled version of something real that's genuinely interesting on its own terms, without needing the embellishments. What actually happened? Researchers at Facebook's AI research lab in 2017 were training chatbot systems to negotiate with each other in English. In an experiment studying how AI agents develop language for negotiation tasks. During training, one of the bots began deviating from grammatical English toward a kind of compressed shorthand, repeating phrases in patterns that looked like nonsense, but which turned out to be a functional internal representation the bots were using to negotiate more efficiently, compressing meaning in ways that worked for them, but weren't designed to be human-readable. The researchers noticed this, found it interesting from a research standpoint, and adjusted the training to constrain the bots to grammatical English, because the experimental goal was studying human-readable negotiation, not optimized machine-to-machine communication. The phrase "shut down" is technically accurate, but dramatically overstated. They modified the training objective. Nobody panicked. The bots weren't building secret codes to escape. They were optimizing their communication for their task, which is what learning systems are designed to do. The actual phenomenon, AI systems developing non-human readable communication patterns when not constrained to human language, is a real and studied area of AI research. It's interesting, it's just not the emergency shutdown robot uprising story that went viral. Story 4, the New Brunswick Neurological Syndrome, a mystery illness that has no diagnosis. In 2019, neurologists in New Brunswick, Canada began noticing a cluster of patients presenting with a neurological syndrome that didn't fit any established diagnosis. The symptoms were severe and progressive, rapidly developing dementia, visual hallucinations, severe muscle pain, difficulty walking and balancing, and other neurological deterioration. The cases resembled Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, the human form of mad cow disease, but testing showed no evidence of prion infection, the misfolded protein that causes CJD. Standard diagnostic frameworks produced no confirmed match. By 2021, the case cluster had grown enough that New Brunswick's Chief Medical Officer of Health was briefed, and the existence of the cluster became public through a leaked health memo. The provincial government's response was cautious, acknowledging the investigation while being careful about language that might cause unnecessary alarm. A scientific committee was convened. Researchers from across Canada and internationally became involved. The investigation proceeded and produced genuine controversy about its own methodology. Some researchers concluded that many of the cases, on re-examination with full access to patient records, fit known diagnoses that had been missed or misassigned. Other researchers, including some directly involved in early patient care, maintained that cases existed that remained genuinely unexplained by known neurological conditions. The cluster investigation was complicated by disagreements over case definition. When cases are defined broadly, the cluster includes cases that probably aren't the same condition. When defined narrowly, the cluster shrinks, but the unexplained core remains. As of the most recent public reporting, the New Brunswick cluster remains an active investigation without a confirmed causative explanation for its core cases. Whether this represents a genuinely new, locally specific neurological condition remains unresolved. Story 5, members of Congress can legally trade stocks based on information they get from their jobs. This one occupies the category of things that are publicly documented, freely available in public records, and somehow persist in public consciousness as a vague sense that something is wrong, rather than as the specific, named, documented practice it is. Members of Congress receive briefings on matters of national importance, economic data before public release, information about pending regulatory decisions, knowledge of government contracts about to be awarded, information about national security, matters with economic implications. They also, simultaneously, legally own and trade individual stocks. The Stock Act, passed in 2012, was supposed to address this by requiring disclosure of trades and prohibiting trading based on non-public information obtained through congressional duties. The enforcement record of the Stock Act is the problem. Violations of the disclosure requirements. Trades that should have been reported within 45 days being reported months or years late, or not at all. have resulted in fines of $200 per violation. Academic research examining trading patterns of congressional members and their family members against the timeline of non-public congressional activity has repeatedly found that, statistically, congressional portfolios outperform the market in ways that correlate with legislative and oversight activity. The returns cannot be confirmed as insider trading without evidence of the specific information used, but the pattern is documented and published. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented feature of how the institution operates, visible in public financial disclosure records, studied by finance and political science researchers, and written about in mainstream publications repeatedly. It persists not because it's hidden, but because the political incentive to change it is exactly what you'd expect from a legislature that benefits from the current arrangement. Story 6: Australia's 2022 floods ended people and erased towns, and were off the front page within weeks. The flooding events that struck the east coast of Australia through 2021 and 2022, particularly the extraordinary rainfall in New South Wales and Queensland, produced disaster statistics that would have sustained months of sustained international attention if they had occurred in different geography. The rainfall totals being described here: over 1,000 millimeters in under 24 hours in some locations, a measurement that represents more rain in a day than many regions receive in a year, were recorded in multiple events across multiple years of flooding that individually and cumulatively displaced hundreds of thousands of people and ended dozens. The specific events varied in their scale and location across this period, but the pattern was consistent. Australian towns not previously known for flood risk were inundated, with some areas flooding repeatedly within 12-month periods, leaving communities in situations where rebuilding made less sense than retreat because the same flooding would recur. Landslides in the regions described destroyed property and infrastructure. People went missing and were subsequently confirmed dead. Emergency services were repeatedly stretched across simultaneously active disaster zones. International media coverage of these events was present but thin relative to comparable events in other regions. Within Australia, the political and policy dimensions, insurance availability and affordability in flood-prone areas, planning decisions that had placed development in flood zones, questions about whether the flooding pattern reflected permanent climatic change rather than exceptional weather were debated with more substance than the international coverage suggested. The pattern of the coverage itself says something. Large-scale natural disasters affecting wealthy countries that are not geopolitically central to the dominant international news frames get treated as regional rather than global stories, regardless of the scale of human cost. Story 7: Unidentified snipers were shooting at cars on I-10 in New Orleans. The story disappeared. Starting in the summer of 2023, a series of incidents occurred on Interstate 10 in the New Orleans area. Cars being struck by projectiles, windshields shattered, in incidents distributed across different stretches of the highway and on different days over an extended period. Local news covered the incidents. Louisiana State Police acknowledged the incidents and investigations, and then the story largely faded from coverage without a confirmed resolution being publicly announced. The specific category of highway shooting incidents, sniper-style attacks on vehicles in motion on a major interstate, is the kind of story that, when it occurs in some contexts, generates sustained national media attention and intensive investigative coverage. The I-10 incidents generated local attention, regional coverage, and then relatively quiet, without the consistent drumbeat of follow-up reporting that would mark a story that national media had decided to treat as ongoing. Whether the investigations produced results that weren't publicly disclosed, whether the incidents were determined to have a mundane rather than criminal cause, or whether the story simply competed unfavorably with other news for sustained attention, is exactly the kind of question that the existing reporting doesn't answer cleanly. Highway shooting investigations are genuinely difficult. The geography is vast. The suspects leave no obvious trace, and witness accounts from moving vehicles and traffic conditions are often limited. What the person sharing this is pointing at is a real phenomenon in local news. Stories that generate genuine community anxiety and initial coverage, that don't produce publicly visible resolution, and that gradually disappear from the news cycle without being formally closed, leaving people who live in the affected area with an unresolved and anxiety-producing gap between what they experienced and what they were told. Story 8: Equifax stole your data and then lost it. The fine was pocket change. The 2017 Equifax data breach is one of the most consequential corporate security failures in American history, and its specific character makes it different from most corporate data breaches in ways that the coverage didn't always make clear. The data that was exposed wasn't data that customers had chosen to give Equifax. It was data Equifax had collected automatically. Names, social security numbers, birth dates, addresses, credit history from essentially every adult American without any individual opting into that collection. Approximately 147 million Americans had their information exposed. They didn't choose to have the information held by Equifax in the first place. The breach occurred because Equifax failed to patch a known security vulnerability in the Apache Struts web framework for approximately 2 months after the patch was available. The vulnerability was publicly documented. The patch was freely available. Equifax didn't apply for it. Attackers who knew about the vulnerability found Equifax's unpatched system and extracted data for approximately 76 days before detection. The Federal Trade Commission settlement reached in 2019 required Equifax to pay up to $700 million, including a $300 million fund for consumer claims. The implementation of the consumer claims process was notably difficult, with the initial per-person cash payment ultimately reduced from $125 to a few dollars as claims volume exceeded the fund's capacity. The free credit monitoring offered as an alternative to cash was provided by Equifax itself, the same company that had just lost your data. Equifax's stock, after dropping initially, recovered. The executives who headed the company during the breach received substantial compensation. The 3 credit reporting bureaus, Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian, continue to collect comprehensive financial data on nearly every American adult, with no opt-out mechanism for the core collection. Story 9: The U.S. military has lost multiple nuclear weapons. Some have never been found. The United States military has a documented category of nuclear weapon incident called a broken arrow, an accidental event involving nuclear weapons that creates the risk of nuclear detonation, radioactive contamination, or loss of a nuclear weapon. The Department of Defense has acknowledged 32 broken arrow incidents between 1950 and 1980. Of these, some resulted in the confirmed recovery of all weapons involved. Others did not. The most significant confirmed missing nuclear weapon in the American record is a Mark 15 hydrogen bomb lost off the coast of Savannah, Georgia, in February 1958, when a mid-air collision between a B-47 and an F-86 caused the crew to jettison the weapon over the Atlantic. The bomb, a 3.4 megaton thermonuclear device, was never recovered. Searches of the area off Tybee Island by the Air Force at the time and subsequently have not located it. The Air Force's position is that the weapon rests on the seabed in shallow coastal water, that it poses no immediate safety risk because the nuclear detonation trigger requires specific deliberate arming steps, and that recovery is not currently pursued because the cost and risk of disturbing the area outweigh the benefits. A 1961 crash at Goldsboro, North Carolina, in which a B-52 broke up and released 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs, resulted in the recovery of one weapon mostly intact and the other in fragments. Investigation of the recovered weapon showed that 5 of the 6 safety mechanisms had failed. One switch had prevented detonation of a multi-megaton nuclear weapon over North Carolina. The Department of Defense's own documents, declassified through FOIA requests, confirmed this assessment. These are documented facts from government records. They are not speculation. Story 10: The Pentagon said UFOs are real, and we can't match them. The story lasted about a week. In December 2017, the New York Times published the story that the Pentagon had been running a secret program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP, specifically to investigate encounters between U.S. military personnel and unidentified aerial phenomena. The story included authenticated video footage from U.S. Navy, encounters showing objects displaying characteristics that the pilots and sensor operators involved could not account for using any known aircraft or natural phenomenon. The Pentagon subsequently confirmed the footage was genuine and that the encounters had occurred. In 2020, the Department of Defense officially released 3 videos of UAP encounters, the Tic Tac, Gimbal, and Go Fast videos, and confirmed they showed unidentified phenomena. In 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment of UAP encounters that reported 143 incidents between 2004 and 2021, and concluded that most could not be identified. In 2023, a former intelligence official named David Grush testified under oath before Congress that the U.S. government had recovered non-human craft and biological material. The person writing this entry is pointing at the coverage response. Each of these developments generated initial reporting, trending social media discussion, and then a fairly rapid return to other news priorities. The specific character of the story, the most powerful government in the world, cannot explain objects operating in its restricted airspace with no obvious explanation, would seem to warrant sustained investigative attention proportional to its significance, if true. Whether the muted, sustained response reflects appropriate journalistic skepticism, the inherent difficulty of covering a story without a clear protagonist or narrative arc, or something about how anomalous information gets processed by large media institutions, is itself an interesting question. Story 11 Facebook ran a psychological experiment on 700,000 users without telling them in January 2012. Researchers working with Facebook conducted an experiment on approximately 689,003 Facebook users without informing them, without obtaining informed consent beyond the general terms of service agreement, and without giving them the ability to opt out of participation. The experiment manipulated what content appeared in users' news feeds, showing some users more positive content and some users more negative content, to test whether emotional contagion could be transmitted through social media, whether seeing more positive posts made people post more positively, and vice versa. The results, published in June 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, confirmed that emotional contagion did occur. Users who were shown more negative content posted more negatively, and users shown more positive content posted more positively. The study demonstrated that a social media platform could measurably influence the emotional content of users' expression through algorithmic manipulation of their information environment, without users being aware this was occurring. The publication produced a significant backlash focused on the ethics of the study, specifically on the question of whether agreeing to Facebook's general terms of service constituted adequate informed consent to being enrolled in a psychological experiment designed to manipulate your emotional state. Researchers and bioethicists pointed out that the study would not have been approved under standard academic human subjects research protocols, which require specific, informed consent for experiments involving psychological manipulation. Facebook's response acknowledged some concern about the study's communication, but defended the underlying research as consistent with the terms of service users had agreed to. The FTC reviewed the matter and took no formal enforcement action. The research continues to be cited in academic literature studying social media and emotional influence. Story 12, a meteor over Scotland slowed down and changed direction. This is not normal. This entry sits at the boundary between a documented unusual observation and the available explanation for it. And what's interesting is that boundary itself. Meteors, by definition, follow ballistic trajectories. They are objects entering Earth's atmosphere under the influence of gravity and momentum, not propelled by any thrust, which means they follow predictable curves and do not slow down mid-flight or change direction under any conventional understanding of what a meteor is. Reports of an object over Scotland demonstrating those specific behaviors, entering, slowing, and altering course, would be inconsistent with a meteor and more consistent with either a controlled aircraft of some kind or a misidentification of an object that wasn't what it appeared to be. The specific incident referenced circulated in UAP and anomalous phenomena communities with enough documentation to be discussed, but without the kind of confirmation that would allow it to be treated as definitively resolved either way. The category of fireball or bolide events, large meteor fragments burning up in the atmosphere, does produce spectacular visual phenomena, including light shows, pressure waves, sonic booms, and fragmentation events that can be genuinely confusing to observe, particularly at night when distance and reference points are difficult to judge accurately. Observers may perceive changes in direction or speed that reflect the inherent difficulty of tracking a fast-moving object against a featureless night sky rather than actual changes in trajectory. Whether the specific observed behaviors here reflect a genuine anomaly, a UAP encounter, or observer interpretation of a conventional bolide event isn't resolvable from the available description. What it points toward is the general category of aerial events that produce credible seeming observer accounts that don't fit conventional categories cleanly. Story 13, the Panama Papers, named the global elite's secret accounts. Nobody significant went to prison. In April 2016, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists released the Panama Papers, 11.5 million documents leaked from the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca, exposing the offshore financial structures used by politicians, business leaders, celebrities, and royalty across dozens of countries to hold, move, and obscure wealth in ways that range from legal tax avoidance to probable criminal tax evasion. The immediate public reaction was genuine and significant. The Prime Minister of Iceland resigned within 2 days. Street protests erupted in multiple countries. Investigative journalists across 80 countries spent months working through the data. The question this entry is asking is what happened afterward at the level of structural consequence. Iceland's Prime Minister resigned. Some individuals in specific countries faced investigations. A few prosecutions occurred in jurisdictions with strong rule of law and political will to pursue the cases. The law firm Mossack Fonseca closed in 2018, which was a consequence of the reputational damage from exposure. The offshore financial architecture the papers exposed, the system of shell companies, nominee directors, and secrecy jurisdictions that allows wealth to be held and moved without public transparency, remains substantially intact and operational. Subsequent leaks, including the Paradise Papers and Pandora Papers, have exposed similar patterns involving largely overlapping populations, confirming that the practices continued after exposure. The specific individuals whose names appeared in the papers who faced no legal consequence in their home jurisdictions, which was the majority, remain in the same positions or have moved to comparable ones. This is the consistent pattern with financial transparency leaks, intense initial coverage, some political casualties, minimal structural reform, and a return to approximately the status quo ante within 18 to 24 months. Story 14, the U.S. paid for nationwide fiber optic cable in the 90s. Where did the cable go? This story is less widely known than it should be given its direct relevance to why the United States has internet infrastructure that significantly underperforms most developed nations in access speed, cost, and coverage. The short version: American telecommunications ratepayers and taxpayers funded, through a combination of regulatory agreements and public subsidies, the build-out of a national fiber optic network in the 1990s. The network was substantially not built. The mechanism, state and federal telecommunications regulations in the early 1990s, created frameworks in which telecom companies, in exchange for various regulatory benefits, committed to deploying fiber optic infrastructure to a specified percentage of homes and businesses by specified dates. These commitments were framed as universal service obligations, in exchange for operating as regulated utilities with specific privileges, The companies would extend high-speed infrastructure broadly, rather than only to profitable urban cores. The subsequent wave of corporate consolidations, mergers, and acquisitions in the telecommunications industry during the late 1990s and early 2000s absorbed these commitments into successor entities, diluted them through regulatory renegotiation, and in many cases simply allowed them to lapse without enforcement action. The infrastructure build-out targets were not met. The regulatory benefits were retained. The fiber that would have represented a fundamental upgrade to American telecommunications infrastructure was not installed at the scale committed to. The result, visible today, is an American broadband market characterized by limited competition in most markets, prices higher than comparable economies, and coverage gaps in rural areas that represent the exact communities the original universal service frameworks were meant to reach. The money and the regulatory consideration went somewhere. The fiber did not follow. Story 15. For about 3 months in 2016, people across the country were dressing as clowns to terrify strangers. In August 2016 in Greenville, South Carolina, children reported that people in clown costumes were standing in wooded areas near apartment complexes at night, attempting to lure them toward the woods. This initial local story, covered by a regional TV station, became the seed of something genuinely strange. Within weeks, similar reports began coming in from across the United States, and then from the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. By October 2016, the creepy clown phenomenon was a documented national and international event, with hundreds of reported sightings, multiple arrests for public disturbance or harassment, school closures in response to clown-related threats, and at least one confirmed death. A man in Pennsylvania who was stabbed after chasing what turned out to be a person in a clown costume. The timeline matters. This happened entirely during the final months of the 2016 U.S. presidential election campaign, which was itself consuming an extraordinary amount of media attention and producing significant social anxiety across the country. The clown phenomenon competed with and was eventually subsumed by the election coverage. What was never fully explained: why then? Why simultaneously across multiple countries? Why clowns, specifically? And who started it? Copycats clearly existed. Once the initial news coverage spread the concept, anyone wanting to participate in a national prank or cause genuine terror had a template. But the initial emergence across multiple locations in the same short window, without an obvious point of origin, remained unexplained. Internet researchers traced some origins to social media posts, but couldn't identify a single trigger event that explained the simultaneous multi-country emergence. It started, it was everywhere, and then it ended, roughly at the point when the election happened, and nobody really went back to ask what it was. Story 16, the Great Smog of London, ended 12,000 people and directly created modern pollution law for 5 days in December 1952. A weather phenomenon combined with industrial and domestic coal, burning to produce a fog over London so dense and so toxic that it caused one of the worst air pollution disasters in recorded history. Temperature inversion trapped cold air near the ground, preventing the normal upward dispersal of pollution from London's millions of coal-burning hearths and its industrial emissions. The result was a thick, acrid, yellow-black smog that reduced visibility to a few meters, shut down transportation, canceled events, and, most significantly, began ending people. The death toll is now estimated at approximately 4,000 directly from the smog itself. People whose respiratory and cardiovascular systems failed under the strain of breathing the polluted air, and as many as 8,000 additional deaths in the following weeks and months from conditions the smog had aggravated. A total excess mortality of 12,000 over the expected baseline is the most commonly cited figure in historical analyses. The victims were disproportionately elderly, very young, and already ill, the population's least able to tolerate the additional respiratory burden. What the Great Smog accomplished politically was significant. It made the pollution problem impossible to ignore at a governmental level. The 1956 Clean Air Act, one of the first comprehensive air pollution control laws in the world, was a direct legislative response. It mandated smokeless zones in urban areas, restricted the types of fuel that could be burned domestically, and established the framework for industrial emission controls that became the basis for subsequent environmental regulation in the United Kingdom and influenced equivalent legislation elsewhere. This is remembered as a historical event now, which it is. At the time, it was a catastrophe that happened in slow motion over 5 days, while the government initially declined to acknowledge its severity. Story 17, the Philippine-American War, ended 200,000 to 700,000 Filipinos and barely made the American history books the Philippine-American War, which began in 1899 following the United States' acquisition of the Philippines from Spain at the end of the Spanish-American War, lasted officially until 1902 and in various forms of armed resistance considerably longer. It is one of the least discussed significant American military conflicts of the 20th century's opening decade, despite casualty figures that, under any modern accounting, would classify it as a major atrocity. The United States paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines under the Treaty of Paris in 1898, and Filipino independence fighters who had been fighting Spanish colonial rule and who had been receiving American support and encouragement during the Spanish-American War found themselves transferred to a new colonial power rather than achieving the independence they had been promised. The war that followed was, from the American side, a counterinsurgency campaign against Filipino forces fighting for independence, and it employed tactics that American military historians have documented, including the systematic burning of villages, the use of torture, including waterboarding, then called the water cure, against prisoners and civilians, and civilian population reconcentration policies that resulted in mass death from disease and starvation. Casualty estimates vary significantly, but consistently point toward enormous civilian mortality. Documented combat deaths among Filipino forces number in the tens of thousands, while civilian deaths from violence, famine, and disease induced by the conflict are estimated by historians at between 200,000 and 700,000. American forces suffered approximately 4,200 combat deaths. This war is not classified as forgotten in academic history departments. It is studied and discussed among historians of American imperialism and military history. It is, however, sufficiently absent from popular American historical consciousness and standard educational curricula that most Americans are unaware it happened. Story 18, the early history of Japan, is a near total blank, and Japan prefers it that way. The Yamato period in Japanese history, conventionally dated from approximately the 4th century CE through the establishment of the Nara period in 710 CE, is the era during which the imperial dynasty that continues to occupy the chrysanthemum throne to this day consolidated its power over the Japanese islands. It is also, from the standpoint of independently verifiable historical documentation, one of the most obscure foundation periods of any major world civilization. The primary documentary sources for this period are the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, compiled in 712 and 720 CE respectively, centuries after the events they describe. Both texts were compiled under imperial patronage and explicitly served political purposes, establishing the divine origin of the imperial line, legitimizing the Yamato clan's supremacy over competing clans, and providing a mythological framework for the imperial institution. Historians treat both texts with significant interpretive caution because of this evident political function. Archaeological evidence, inscriptions from neighboring cultures in Korea and China, and comparative analysis with other sources provide some independent corroboration for certain events and timelines. But the specific claims about the founding of the imperial line, the early emperors and their extraordinarily long legendary lifespans, and the nature of early political organization are not confirmed by independent sources in ways that would meet the evidentiary standards historians apply to other historical periods. The imperial institution's continuous existence, the current emperor is the 126th in the official lineage, gives this early obscure period particular modern sensitivity. Japan's government has historically exercised significant influence over archaeological work near imperial burial mounds, restricting independent excavation in ways that limit what physical evidence can contribute to the historical record of this period. Story 19, the Battle of Tours, stopped the Islamic conquest of Europe, if you believe the sources. The Battle of Tours, fought in October 732, see between Frankish forces under Charles Martel and an Umayyad force that had been conducting raids into Frankish territory from Islamic Iberia, has been described in Western historiography as one of the most significant battles in European history. The battle that stopped the Islamic conquest of Europe and preserved Christian civilization in the West. Edward Gibbon famously speculated that had Charles Martel been defeated, Muslim armies might have eventually carried Islam to the Polish border, and Oxford seminarians might today be teaching the Quran. The actual historical record of the battle is considerably more ambiguous than this dramatic framing suggests. The primary sources are limited, written from exclusively European Christian perspectives, and serve obvious political and religious purposes. Islamic sources of the period are sparse on the specifics of this engagement. What historians can establish with reasonable confidence: a military engagement occurred in the Tours region. The Umayyad commander Abd al-Rahman was terminated, and Frankish forces prevailed. What's considerably less certain, the scale of the Umayyad force, whether this represented a major invasion or a large-scale raid, and whether a different outcome would have actually produced the sustained Islamic expansion into Europe that the decisive battle interpretation assumes. Islamic historians of the period characterize the engagement differently, and the subsequent history of Umayyad activity in Iberia and France suggests the tactical situation was more complex than a single decisive battle. The Battle of Tours is real history. That the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance interpretation is a later construction that subsequent historians have substantially qualified. Story 20, Caesar's War in Gaul. We know it mainly from Caesar's own account of Caesar's war in Gaius Julius Caesar's Commentary de Beo Gallico. His account of the Gallic Wars he conducted between 58 and 50 BC is one of the most celebrated prose works in Latin literature and one of the foundational primary sources for an 8-year military campaign that ended, by Caesar's own account, approximately 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million. It is also, quite openly, propaganda written by the general conducting the campaign to justify and glorify his own actions to a Roman political audience that might otherwise question the legality and morality of what he was doing. Caesar was operating in Gaul under a military command that required continued enemy action to remain politically justified. He was writing dispatches to Rome and ultimately a memoir that served his political interests. This is not a secret or a conspiracy. Ancient historians and modern scholars alike acknowledge the deeply interested character of the source. The problem is that for many of the specific events and decisions of the Gallic Wars, Caesar's account is essentially the only substantial surviving source. The Gallic perspective on the conquest doesn't exist in writing because Gaulish cultures did not have a tradition of written historical documentation at this level. What we know about the resistance, the casualties, the political structures Caesar destroyed, and the experience of conquered and enslaved Gauls is filtered entirely through the accounts of the people who conquered and enslaved them. The entry is making a genuine point about historical epistemology. Much of what everyone knows about famous historical events comes from sources with obvious interested parties. And the alternative perspectives, the Gauls, the opponents, the subjugated populations, are often simply absent from the record in any recoverable form. Story 21, the Bronze Age collapse. Civilization just stopped. Nobody knows why. Around 1200 BC, over the span of roughly 50 years, essentially every significant civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously collapsed. The Egyptian New Kingdom nearly fell and permanently contracted. The Hittite Empire, which had been one of the great powers of the ancient world, disappeared entirely. Its capital Hattusa burned and abandoned, never reoccupied. The Mycenaean Greek palace civilizations that had produced the world of the Iliad collapsed and were forgotten for 3,000 years. The great city of Ugarit in Syria was destroyed and permanently abandoned. The Canaanite cities declined dramatically. Widespread trade networks that had connected the region ceased functioning. What followed was a Dark Ages period of several centuries during which population levels declined dramatically across the region. Literacy disappeared in many areas. Monumental architecture ceased, and the complex administrative and commercial structures that had sustained these civilizations simply vanished. When the region recovered, it had new peoples, new languages, and new political structures. The direct political continuity of the Bronze Age civilizations was broken. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse are one of archaeology's great unsolved questions and have been studied intensively. Proposed explanations include invasions by the Sea Peoples, drought and climate change, earthquakes, internal revolts, systems collapse, and combinations of these factors. No single explanation has achieved scholarly consensus. A complex, interconnected civilization collapsed within 50 years, and nobody fully understands why. The mystery is 3,000 years old and still open. Story 22: The Battle of Longtan. 108 Australian soldiers held off 2,500 enemy fighters for hours on August 18, 1966. D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was patrolling a rubber plantation near Longtan in the Phuoc Thi province of South Vietnam when it encountered what turned out to be a force of approximately 2,500 North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong fighters. D Company had 108 men. What followed was a battle in a tropical rainstorm, with the Australian force taking cover in the rubber trees, while artillery and resupply by helicopter were the only factors that kept them from being overrun before relief arrived. The battle lasted approximately 3.5 hours. 18 Australians were killed and 24 wounded. Subsequent casualty counts of the opposing force, based on body counts and prisoner reports, suggested somewhere between 245 and 500 ended. The artillery support that proved decisive was Australian and New Zealand guns firing from Firebase Nui Dat, directed by forward observers who maintained coordination through the battle, with the rest of the force cut off and barely holding. Longtan is well known in Australia as a significant Vietnam War engagement and is commemorated annually on August 18 as Vietnam Veterans Day. The level of awareness of the battle in other Western countries, including the United States, which had vastly larger forces in Vietnam for longer, is considerably lower than the battle's tactical outcome would suggest, particularly given that a force of 108 soldiers successfully holding against a force of 2,500 is the kind of engagement that military histories tend to celebrate extensively. The battles and losses of smaller allied nations in Vietnam tend to receive less attention in the American-dominated narrative of the war than their actual contributions might warrant. Story 23: The U.S. invaded Grenada in 1983, and the media was not allowed to cover it. Operation Urgent Fury, the American military invasion of the Caribbean island of Grenada in October 1983, holds a specific and rarely discussed place in the history of American press freedom. It was the first major American military operation from which journalists were entirely excluded during the initial phases, establishing a precedent for media management in military operations that shaped every subsequent American military campaign. The stated justification for the invasion included the protection of American medical students at St. George's University, concerns about a Marxist coup that had just ended Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, and the presence of Cuban construction workers building an airport that American officials characterized as a potential military facility. The operation was largely successful militarily, achieving its objectives within several days. The exclusion of journalists was deliberate and specifically planned. The Reagan administration and military planners had concluded that media coverage during and immediately after the invasion created political problems, and they controlled access during the operation. Journalists who attempted to reach Grenada independently were intercepted at sea by the Navy. When journalists were eventually allowed in, the operation was effectively complete. The American public thus received its information about the invasion primarily through official military briefings and subsequently approved media access, an information environment controlled by the entity conducting the operation. The Grenada press exclusion was controversial enough to generate a task force study that resulted in the creation of the press pool system that has governed subsequent military operations, embedding small numbers of journalists with units in ways that provide access while maintaining significant operational influence over what is seen and reported. Story 24, the Miami Mall alien incident. What actually happened and why it went everywhere on the night of January 1, 2024. A large fight involving dozens of people broke out in the Bayside Marketplace outdoor mall in Miami, leading to a massive police response. Dozens of police vehicles, road closures, and a visible law enforcement presence that was photographed and filmed extensively by people present. This much is documented and not disputed. What happened next is the specific 21st century media phenomenon this entry is actually about. A combination of viral social media posts claiming to show shadowy figures in the videos, misidentified objects, and the general excitement of New Year's night combined to produce claims that the police response was related to aliens or non-human entities in the mall, rather than a large crowd disturbance. Miami police subsequently issued clear statements explaining that the response was to a large fight, that there were no aliens involved, and that the videos purporting to show alien creatures were misidentified or manipulated. The Miami-Dade Police Department's social media account specifically noted, "There are no aliens, UFOs, or ETs," and attributed the large police response to the crowd disturbance that had actually occurred. This specific incident is interesting as a case study in how viral misinformation propagates in the social media era. A real event with mundane causes generates video documentation. A layer of misidentification and excited claims is applied in real time. And by the time official clarification arrives, the aliens in the Miami Mall narrative has reached audiences that will never see the correction. The story as it circulated and as it happened are two different stories, and many more people encountered the first version than the second. Story 25, the Federal Reserve was created in secret at a private Jekyll Island meeting in 1910. The creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913 is one of the most significant institutional events in American economic history, and the specific manner of its planning is documented in a way that, if proposed as a conspiracy theory, before the participants confirmed it themselves, would sound implausible. A group of prominent bankers and a senator's aide traveled in secret to Jekyll Island, Georgia in November 1910 under cover of a duck hunting trip to draft what became the Federal Reserve Act. They used first names only during the journey. The participants confirmed the meeting's existence and purpose decades later in their memoirs. The Jekyll Island participants included Paul Warburg of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, Henry Davison of J.P. Morgan and Company, Benjamin Strong, who would become the first head of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, Charles Norton of First National Bank of New York, Piott Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and Senator Nelson Aldrich, whose name was on the draft legislation that emerged. This was, in terms of the concentration of private financial and governmental power in one room, a genuinely extraordinary gathering. The draft they produced at Jekyll Island formed the basis of the legislation that, after significant political modification and public debate, became the Federal Reserve Act, signed by Woodrow Wilson in December 1913. The public legislative process included genuine debate and significant modification of the original proposal. The substance of what was created, a central banking system with a complex structure giving significant influence to private banks within a federal framework, reflects the interests of the people who designed it, which is not unusual in the history of financial regulation. This is not a secret. The participants wrote about it. The history is documented. It is simply not well known. Story 26, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, is still alive and on death row. His story barely gets coverage. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev convicted of the Boston Marathon bombing that ended 3 people and wounded hundreds on April 15, 2013, was sentenced to death in 2015. He is currently on death row at a federal facility. His legal case has moved through the appeals process for years. In 2020, the First Circuit Court of Appeals vacated his death sentence and ordered a new penalty phase, finding issues with the jury selection process. In 2022, the Supreme Court reversed that decision and reinstated the death sentence in a ruling that addressed the specific legal questions about juror impartiality raised in the appeal. The person writing this entry is noting something that's true about ongoing criminal cases. After the initial coverage of the crime, the trial, and the sentencing, the day-to-day existence of a convicted person and the grinding procedural progress of their appeals case generates very little public attention. Tsarnaev is in federal custody. His case is proceeding through the legal system. He is not free, has not escaped, and has not done anything else notable. None of these facts are interesting enough to sustain ongoing coverage. What occasionally generates renewed coverage of his case are the appellate court decisions, which have produced genuinely significant legal questions about death penalty procedure and jury selection. The Supreme Court case specifically involved important questions about how courts must assess juror impartiality in high-profile cases where extensive pretrial publicity has saturated the prospective jury pool. The survivor community from the bombing has maintained a sustained presence in media coverage around anniversary dates and at significant legal moments. Beyond that, the story of an imprisoned person in the federal system doesn't generate ongoing news without new events to drive it. Story 27 in 1933. Wealthy American businessmen plotted a military coup against FDR. One told Congress. The business plot of 1933 is the name given to an alleged conspiracy in which a group of wealthy American businessmen and industrialists recruited a highly decorated Marine Corps general, Smedley Butler, to lead a coup against the Roosevelt administration and install a fascist government modeled on European examples. The source for this claim is Smedley Butler himself, who testified before the House Special Committee on Un-American Activities in 1934. Butler's testimony described being approached by Gerald McGuire, a Bond salesman, with the proposal to use Butler's military reputation and his connections with the American Legion to assemble a paramilitary force of 500,000 veterans that would march on Washington. Butler stated that the plot's backers included figures connected to J.P. Morgan interests, the DuPont family, and other industrial wealth. Butler said he had played along to gather information and then reported the matter to authorities. The committee confirmed the core of Butler's account, that there had indeed been a plot, that McGuire had met with Butler as described, and that the contacts Butler named were genuine. The report stated, "There is no question that these attempts were made to enlist General Butler in this plot." The committee did not pursue criminal charges or name all the alleged participants publicly. Some of the individuals implicated either denied involvement or died before the investigation was complete. The historical memory of the business plot is limited partly because the committee chose not to pursue criminal prosecution and partly because the dramatic implications of a confirmed coup plot against a sitting president received relatively muted subsequent treatment in mainstream American historical education. Story 28 Starfish Prime. America detonated a nuclear bomb in space and accidentally knocked out satellites on July 9, 1962. The United States military detonated a thermonuclear weapon in space, 400 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean, as part of a series of high-altitude nuclear tests called Operation Fishbowl. The weapon was a W-49 thermonuclear warhead with a yield of approximately 1.4 megatons. The test was called Starfish Prime. The immediate effects were spectacular and visible from Hawaii. Approximately 1,400 kilometers away, an artificial aurora borealis lit up the night sky. Power surges caused streetlights in Hawaii to fail, and the electromagnetic pulse from the detonation damaged electronic systems across the region. What the test planners had not fully anticipated was the longer-term effect. The detonation created an artificial radiation belt around Earth, trapping energetic particles in orbit that damaged or destroyed a significant number of operational satellites. Estimates range from 1/3 to 1/2 of all satellites in low Earth orbit at the time, including several American scientific satellites and British and Soviet spacecraft. Starfish Prime is the most powerful nuclear detonation in space in history, and its effects on satellite technology demonstrated that nuclear weapons detonated in near-Earth space could effectively destroy the orbital infrastructure of any nation, not just the nations targeted. The artificial radiation belt from Starfish Prime persisted at measurable levels for years. The test contributed directly to the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear testing in outer space, the atmosphere, and underwater. It is documented, published history. The entry's 1974 date is a slight error. Starfish Prime was 1962, though the cleanup and monitoring of its effects continued for years afterward. Story 29: The Greenbrier Ghost. The only case in American legal history where a ghost's testimony convicted a murderer in 1897 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. A woman named Elva Zona Heister died unexpectedly. Her husband, Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, found her body and handled the arrangements for her examination and burial in ways that the local doctor, who only briefly examined the body, found unusual. Shue was intensely controlling about access to the body, wrapped her neck himself, and was emotionally erratic during the process. Elva Heister's mother, Mary Jane Heister, claimed in the weeks following the death that her daughter's ghost appeared to her on 4 consecutive nights and provided a detailed account of how she had died. She had broken her neck in a fit of rage. Heister reported this to the local prosecutor, and largely on the basis of this account, combined with the suspicious circumstances that the original doctor review had been too cursory to establish, an exhumation was ordered. The autopsy revealed that Elva Shue had indeed died of a broken neck, with evidence of manual trauma inconsistent with a natural death. Erasmus Shue was tried for murder. At the trial, the prosecutor called Mary Jane Heister to testify about what the ghost had told her, making this the only documented instance in American legal history where spectral testimony was admitted in court. The jury convicted Shue of murder. He died in prison in 1900. The Greenbrier ghost case is legally and historically anomalous precisely because the ghost story, whether or not one accepts its supernatural dimensions, preceded and prompted the exhumation that produced the physical evidence that actually convicted the murderer. Whatever caused Mary Jane Heister to tell that story led directly to evidence that was real. Story 30: Project Sunshine. The U.S. government secretly collected body parts from dead babies. Project Sunshine was a classified U.S. Atomic Energy Commission program that ran from the 1950s into the 1960s, designed to assess the degree to which nuclear weapons testing was contaminating the global environment by measuring strontium-90 accumulation in human bones. The specific characteristic of strontium-90 that made bone measurement essential was that it behaves chemically like calcium and therefore concentrates in bone tissue, where it irradiates surrounding bone marrow. The EC and its scientific contractors needed bone samples from recently deceased individuals, particularly infants and young children, whose shorter lives provided cleaner measurements of strontium-90 accumulation from the period of atmospheric nuclear testing. The program collected these samples from hospitals, morgues, and other institutions across the United States and internationally, typically without informing the families of the deceased. Body parts were removed during autopsies, cataloged, and shipped to analysis facilities, all without the knowledge or consent of the families. This wasn't discovered by the program's subjects or their families at the time. It came to light through investigative journalism in the 1990s, specifically through reporting by Eileen Wellsome and a subsequent Australian Broadcasting Corporation documentary. The Australian government conducted its own investigation and confirmed that Australian families had been affected by similar collections under agreements with the EC. The scientific purpose was real. The data collected contributed to understanding of radioactive contamination and eventually to the policy arguments that supported the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The method, covert collection of tissue from deceased children without family knowledge or consent, is the specific fact that has caused this program to be regarded as a serious ethical violation by any standard of human subjects research ethics. Story 31, the 1916 New Jersey shark attacks created the modern fear of sharks and inspired Jaws in July 1916. 5 people were attacked by sharks along the New Jersey shore over a 12-day period, 4 of them fatally. The attacks occurred in an unprecedented sequence, the first in beach surf near Beach Haven on July 1. Subsequent attacks further north along the coast, including in Matawan Creek, 12 miles inland from the ocean, on July 12, which resulted in 2 deaths. The Matawan Creek attacks were particularly alarming because they occurred in a tidal creek well inland, contradicting the assumption that sharks were exclusively offshore threats. The attacks were significant enough to produce a genuine national panic, drive tourists from New Jersey beaches during the peak summer season, and prompt coordinated hunting efforts against sharks along the coast. President Woodrow Wilson convened a cabinet meeting to discuss the crisis, which is an indication of how seriously the situation was taken at federal level. The scientific legacy of the 1916 attacks was substantial. They prompted the first serious American scientific attention to shark behavior and feeding patterns, moving sharks from a category of creatures that many naturalists had considered incapable of ending a human being into a documented threat whose behavior warranted systematic study. The attacks contributed to a fundamental revision of understanding of great white shark behavior, range, and feeding patterns that had previously underestimated all 3. The cultural legacy is even more direct. Peter Benchley's research for his 1974 novel Jaws drew specifically on the 1916 New Jersey attacks, and the specific plot element of the shark appearing in an inland waterway mirrors the Matawan Creek incident. The modern cultural fear of sharks in American culture has a specific, documentable origin point in 12 days in July 1916 along the New Jersey shore. Story 32, Canada's strategic maple syrup reserve was robbed of 3,000 tonnes. The thieves were eventually caught. The Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist of 2011-2012 is the kind of story that sounds like the setup for a comedy film and turns out to be genuine, documented, large-scale organized theft. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers maintains a strategic reserve of maple syrup, a literal warehouse stockpile of hundreds of thousands of barrels of syrup, held to stabilize the market against variation in annual production, that is managed somewhat like a cartel commodity reserve. In 2011 and 2012, thieves systematically drained approximately 300 tons of maple syrup from this reserve, replacing the syrup in barrels with water to delay discovery and transport the stolen product. The operation was discovered in 2012 during a routine audit when auditors noticed that barrels appearing intact and full were actually significantly lighter than they should have been, having been drained and refilled with water. The total value of the stolen syrup was approximately $18 million Canadian dollars, making it one of the largest food heists in history by value. Subsequent investigation identified the perpetrators, a group including warehouse workers with access to the facility, and a network of buyers and intermediaries who handled distribution of the stolen product. Several people were convicted and sentenced, with one principal receiving a sentence of 8 years in prison. The stolen syrup had been sold to buyers across Quebec and into the United States. This story is genuinely funny in its specifics and genuinely serious as a crime. The Canadian maple syrup market is tightly regulated precisely to maintain the price stability and producer income that the reserve is designed to protect, and the theft undermined that structure in real ways. It generated significant coverage at the time and has retained a peculiar cultural afterlife as one of the stranger crimes of the 21st century. Story 33, AB-52 crashed at Thule Air Base in 1968 with 4 nuclear weapons aboard. One was never found. On January 21, 1968, a U.S. Air Force B-52 Stratofortress bomber carrying 4 B-28 nuclear bombs crashed and caught fire on the ice of North Star Bay near Thule Air Base in Greenland. The crash occurred after a fire broke out in the aircraft's cabin, forcing the crew to bail out before being able to land safely. 6 of the 7 crew members survived. 1 was killed. The crash and subsequent fire caused 2 of the weapon's conventional high explosives to detonate, scattering radioactive material, including plutonium and uranium, across a wide area of sea ice. The contamination was significant enough to require a major cleanup operation. Codenamed Project Crested Ice, which involved approximately 700 American and Danish workers, and the removal of approximately 233,000 cubic feet of contaminated ice, snow, and debris. Several workers from this cleanup have subsequently filed claims related to radiation exposure. The recovery of the nuclear weapons, or more precisely, the failure to recover all of them, is the specific fact that this entry is pointing toward. American and Danish officials confirmed in declassified documents released in the 1990s that recovery teams recovered significant portions of 3 weapons and secondary components of the 4th. But the secondary stage of the 4th weapon, a substantial piece of the bomb containing fissile material, was never recovered from the floor of North Star Bay. The Danish government, which had maintained publicly that no nuclear weapons were stored in Greenland, negotiated the cleanup and accepted American assurances about the outcome. The full scope of what was and wasn't recovered from the crash was not publicly disclosed until the 1990s declassification. Story 34: Britain secretly produced 5 million cattle cakes filled with anthrax to drop on Germany in 1942. Operation Vegetarian was a British biological warfare program developed during World War II that progressed far enough into production to represent a genuinely planned capability. Rather than a theoretical concept, the operation involved the production of approximately 5 million small linseed cake pellets, the kind of feed supplement routinely given to German cattle, laced with anthrax spores, intended to be dropped from aircraft over German agricultural land to be consumed by cattle, ending the livestock and potentially spreading anthrax to the human population handling the animals. The program reached the stage of actual production. The 5 million cakes were manufactured and stored, ready for deployment by 1942. They were never used. The Allied strategic situation improved sufficiently that the biological attack was judged unnecessary, and the program was wound down. The stockpiled cakes were incinerated at a facility in Scotland in 1945. The testing of anthrax delivery at Gruinard Island in Scotland, a separate component of Britain's biological warfare research, left the island contaminated with anthrax spores for decades. Gruinard was declared safe following decontamination efforts in 1990, 48 years after the initial testing, which gives a sense of the persistence of anthrax contamination in soil. Operation Vegetarian is documented in declassified British government records and is discussed in histories of World War II biological warfare programs. It represents one of the furthest advanced examples of a biological warfare capability that was produced for deployment and not used. And its production scale, 5 million delivery vehicles, indicates that it was taken seriously as a genuine operational option, rather than a purely theoretical program. Story 35: The Kishtim Disaster. The Soviet nuclear explosion nobody was allowed to know about on September 29, 1957. A chemical explosion in a storage tank at the Mayak nuclear facility in the Soviet Union near the town of Kishtim released an estimated 70 to 80 tons of radioactive material into the atmosphere, contaminating approximately 20,000 square kilometers of land across the Ural region. It is the 3rd worst nuclear accident in history by radioactive contamination level after Chernobyl and Fukushima. The Soviet government classified the accident entirely. People in contaminated villages were evacuated without being told why. Workers were sent into contaminated areas without adequate protection or information. The international scientific community began noticing an anomaly in scientific publications from the Soviet Union in the late 1950s. A sudden absence of papers on certain biological and ecological topics from researchers in the Ural region that had previously been publishing regularly, as though a scientific community had simply stopped working. The British-American intelligence community acquired information about the accident during the late 1950s through espionage, and the CIA reportedly had knowledge of the disaster while publicly keeping silent to avoid a political situation that would highlight the inherent dangers of civilian nuclear power at a time when Western governments were promoting nuclear energy development. This allegation that Western intelligence services knew about Kishtim and chose not to publicize it has been a subject of historical research and remains a matter of documented intelligence history rather than pure speculation. The entry here references a 1989 precursor. This may be a conflation with different events. Kishtim itself was 1957. The long-term health consequences for affected populations continued to be studied and contested for decades, with Soviet and subsequently Russian authorities releasing information gradually over many years.